Good afternoon, and welcome to today's installment of the 2023 January series. I am Shelton Rodriguez, a senior from St. Mark, Haiti, studying public health and global development. Would you please take a moment to silence your cell phones? As you are doing so, I would like to welcome guests at all of our remote viewing locations, including Holland, Michigan, Tucson, Arizona, and Bellflower, California, and all our virtual attendees across time zones. We are grateful you are joining us today. And now, would you please join me in a word of prayer? Dear Heavenly Father, we welcome you into this space for those who are present with us and for those online. We ask that you bless the speaker, that you bless their word. May it be meaningful and resonate with those who are listening. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and what it represents. Thank you for creating us as intricate masterpieces with the ability to love and be loved by all people. May we bring your kingdom amongst each other this year so our actions and our thoughts may be pleasing unto you. To you be the glory forever. Amen. And now, Michelle Lloyd-Page, Executive Associate to the President for Diversity and Inclusion, will introduce our guest.
It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Gregory Thompson. Gregory Thompson currently serves as the Executive Director of Voices Underground, an initiative to build a national memorial to the Underground Railroad in Southeast Pennsylvania. Gregory's story is one of transformation, from being a person who had little awareness of his and his family's connection to the racialized history in the United States to one who seeks to educate others about the racialized story of this country. Getting into a conversation with him, you will quickly see that it will turn to race, reparations, and reconciliation. His is a voice that we need to hear in this hour. As a scholar and a writer, he has studied the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He is currently writing a book on the role of love, say that with me, the role of love in the work of Dr. King. While many recognize King as an ultimate symbol of justice and change, Thompson asks the question if the message of love has been forgotten or ignored and why we aren't embracing it. On this day where we celebrate the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a nation, I am so pleased to have his voice speak to us today. I want you to know that following the presentation, Gregory will be available to greet the audience in the West Lobby of the Covenant Fine Arts Center. And if you're directionally challenged like I am, just follow the signs. Calvin University is grateful to Larry and Mary Gerbins for underwriting today's presentation. Please welcome Gregory Thompson.
Thank you. I want first to say thank you for the opportunity to be here. As a Southern man, to honor the legacy of Martin Luther King, to do what my community should have done and didn't. It's a very great opportunity to be a part of this day today, so thank you. And also because it allows me the opportunity to continue to reflect on my own commitment to his legacy and to the work of love, and that is never lost, so I'm very grateful to you. The talk today is called To Stick with Love, King's Vision for Today's Movement. On Wednesday morning, August 16th, 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And seated before him were his friends and his colleagues and his community. They were at the 10th anniversary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They were having this celebration. And just 2 nights before, they filled the ballroom, the grand ballroom of Atlanta's new Hyatt Regency Hotel, and they had speeches and a dinner, and then they had a performance by Aretha Franklin. I want to go to that kind of conference. And then they followed that with workshops on poverty and on housing issues and on the war in Vietnam. But this morning, they filled the sanctuary of King's Historic Church to listen to his SCLC presidential address, an address whose stated theme was, "Where do we go from here?" They wanted to hear him speak not only about the 10 years past, but also, perhaps more importantly, about the years to come. Now, in some respects, this was an utterly ordinary scene. King standing in his family's pulpit, looking over his closest colleagues and family, speaking on customary themes and using well-worn phrases. They were in familiar territory. But even so, as King made his way to the pulpit, his steps silent on the carpet, there was a strange tension in the air, a palpable mixture of anxiety and expectation, a sense that they were now moving out of the familiar and into the unknown. Because in truth, both King and his community, those who traveled with him, were already in a space of unknown and had been for 2 years. See, for most of their history, King and the SCLC had presided over a series of social triumphs that bordered on the miraculous. The integration of public transportation, private business, public schools, the galvanizing march on Washington, the global approbation of the Nobel Peace Prize, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And though each of these moments was attended by difficulty and tragedy, they had reason to be confident in both their leader and their approach because the fruit was undeniable, right? But starting in early 1965, this confidence began slowly to falter. This faltering was driven by forces largely outside of King's control, the grotesque violence of Selma, the collapse of civil rights alliances, the escalation of the Vietnam War, growing anger over American material inequality, the rise of the Black Power movement, and shifting tides of public interest and concern. Each of those things transformed the movement, moving it beyond the familiar patterns, in some ways beyond King himself. And yet, even as they did so, they converged forcefully upon him and created a crucible around him and pressed King into the greatest crisis of his life. This crisis, which lasted roughly from the brutality of Selma in 1965 to King's murder in Memphis in 1968, was a period of unprecedented suffering and transformation for King, altering virtually every aspect of his life. Reputationally, he went from being a globally honored laureate in 1964 to being described in 1967 as the most hated man in America. Politically, he went from having the President of the United States as an ally to being actively persecuted by members of that own president's administration. Relationally, he went from being the revered center of a global movement to being mocked, marginalized, and maligned by his former friends. Vocationally, he went from the relatively narrow struggle for racial equality in the American South to the much larger struggle of transforming all of America. And spiritually, he went from being a prophet who dreamed of national reconciliation to being a depressed and despondent man who spoke regularly about his own death. These crisis years were, in other words, a definitive period of transformation, both for King and for the movement that he led. And when King stood before his audience on that Wednesday morning, he spoke from within this crucible. Now, over the past several decades, not a small amount of scholarly attention has been given to understanding this transformation, the meaning of this crucible. And this research has been really important, both granular and expansive. It's granular because it is carefully attended to details of King's later years that people like to ignore. But it's also expansive because it greatly enlarges our understanding of King and requires us to engage with his increasingly radical accounts of enduring racism, exploitative capitalism, and cultic militarism that he saw in American culture. Now, the effect of this scholarly reinterpretation is that it delivers King from his captivity to the sentimental vagaries of our cultural imagination and restores to him his enduringly prophetic fire. This scholarship has been essential to developing our picture of King, a more mature understanding of him and of the movement that he led. But one of the other effects of this scholarship has been the way that it obscures the critical ways in which King remained the same. There is at present broad agreement that King's early ministry is best understood as the pursuit of democratic equality through the means of nonviolent direct action in the interest of beloved community. That's what King's early ministry was, the pursuit of democratic equality through nonviolent direct action in the interest of beloved community. But where there is less agreement is what happened to King and what happened to those convictions during his crucible years. Because there's this recognition that in King's crucible years, he was forced both by other movement leaders and by his circumstances to seriously reconsider each one of those commitments. And so there's now clarity with what happened to those, a lack of clarity with what happened to those commitments during those years, to what extent he maintained them, and to what extent he laid them aside. That this is so can be seen in the emergence of two different versions of king, and I bet you're familiar with them. The one that is most familiar is the one that is in the popular imagination. That's the king of the bus boycott, the Gandhian nonviolence, of the dream speech. The king, the inspired and inspiring icon of beloved community. But a second portrait, however, offers a strikingly different king, a king in which he was chastened by growing understanding of both the scale of American injustice and of America's pathological resistance to change, where he began slowly to move away from these theologically funded convictions and toward a racial consciousness, a social despair, and a political radicalism that marked the movement around him, and that transformation was only incomplete because of his untimely death. So one portrayal of King suggests that the crucible years left him unchanged, and the other suggests that it changed him altogether. Which is it? While each of these accounts say something true about the crucible years, neither captures the full truth, because the first fails to understand the degree to which the suffering of his latter years transformed him, and thereby misses the important intellectual and moral fruit that emerged from the fertility of that suffering. But the second fails to reckon seriously with the ways in which King, even in the midst of this crucible, nonetheless chose to remain the same, and thereby devalues both the reality and the substance of his extraordinary moral perseverance. The result of each of these is not simply a diminished account of King, but also of the movement that he sought to lead, a movement that was not only socially expansive, but morally distinctive. Now, in contrast to each of these, like my basic argument is that King's crucible years are best understood neither in terms of stasis nor in terms of renunciation, but as an agonizing practice of interrogating, refining, and ultimately recommitting himself to the animating moral core of his vision for the movement. That vision? Love made flesh in the streets of this world. Perhaps nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in the most famous line of his presidential address from that Wednesday morning. I have decided to stick with love. These are some of the most well-known words in King's corpus. They're quoted in speeches, they're painted in murals. Look today, they're certainly on social media. And yet, surprisingly little attention has been paid to this excruciating context out of which they emerged and how this context might illumine our understanding of why he said them on that day, what he meant by them, and what sort of movement he sought to build. The truth is that these words were not simply tired and inevitable restatements of an old theme. To the contrary, they represent a deliberate and defiant decision to reassert the primacy of love as the only possible foundation for our collective healing. At its heart, my lecture today is a meditation upon King's decision, a decision made in suffering and sealed in blood, in the bitterest time of his life, to stick with love. I believe that this is foundational not only for understanding King's mature vision of his work, but also for what it means for those of us who seek to follow him in our time. Here's why I care about this. One of my burdens for this meditation is to continue to press scholarly interpreters of King and of his legacy to give more robust attention to love until its meaning. Everybody agrees that he talks about love, but the account of both his spiritual substance and the social shape seems to me to still be only vaguely understood. And so I offer this in part as a contribution to scholarly conversations about the interpretation of King's legacy. But the true burden of my work here is not scholarly but social. It's forged not in the quiet of the library, but in the fury of the streets. Next month marks a decade since the senseless and unaccountable killing of Trayvon Martin at the hands of George Zimmerman. Since that time, this event that seemed to many Americans to be singularly awful has become almost commonplace. So commonplace, in fact, that as the hashtag Say Their Names trend reminds us, not a small part of the work of injustice is simply being able to remember those who have fallen under it and saying their names aloud. Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald, Eric Garner, Clemente Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Tywanda Sanders, Ethel Lance, Susie Jackson, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Daniel Simmons, Myra Thompson, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Natasha McKenna, Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Stephen Clark, Botham Jean. And over the course of the decade between now and Trayvon Martin's killing, a discernible stream of social restlessness has begun to spill over from conventional activist circles and make its way into mainstream public discourse, in time coalescing into a loosely organized movement centered around the affirmation of Black life. But as you know, in the first half of 2020, when you saw these horrible murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and especially George Floyd, the scope and power of this new movement for Black life came fully into view. Within days, protesters were marching under the banner of Black Lives Matter. They sprang up around the world. Indeed, between March and November of 2020, marches took place in 4,000 cities internationally, from Indonesia to Greenland to Senegal to South Dakota. But these protests were not merely contained in the streets. Social media companies, corporations began to pick it up. IBM, Microsoft, Amazon stopped sharing facial recognition software with law enforcement agencies. And foundations such as Ford, Mellon, Kresge, and so on launched grant-making initiatives targeted to the support of racial justice. It was extraordinary. I mean, taken in itself, this convergence of popular corporate, philanthropic, and media interest signaled the arrival of a new moment in the history of the struggle for Black liberation. But set against the backdrop of a global pandemic, the socially disintegrated presidency of Donald Trump, growing mistrust in democratic institutions, and resurgent forms of ethnic nationalism, and the epistemologically isolating effects of social media. This time also signaled the arrival of a civic crisis. It signaled that the movement and the nation itself was moving into a crucible of its own. And so it has. The nearly 24 months since the protests began in 2020 have been the most tumultuous in living memory. In this brief time, Americans have seen our cities burn, our police assault peaceful protesters. Leaders blame the victimized. Our political alliances fracture. We've seen neighbors lose jobs, businesses, and homes. We've seen our children lose years of education. We've seen a sitting president openly attempt to subvert a democratic electoral process. We've seen his followers violently assault our nation's capital. And we've seen nearly 7 million people die in the midst of a global public health crisis. And the effects of what we have seen on our political order, our public culture, our private relationships, and our psychological health is beyond calculation. King's crucible has become the crucible of us all. And of the many questions raised in this crucible, one of the most important is what role, if any, love will play in our communities and in the movement for justice within them. This was a central question for King in his time of crisis, and I believe that it is a central question for us now. And this is not merely an academic question, because the way that we answer it will tell us not only what we think about King or the movement he sought to lead, but also about ourselves and about the life that we seek to lead together. Now, over the past several years, as I've joined my communities in the work of justice, either in marches or sitting at dining room tables or government offices or on Zoom calls, I've begun to sense this emerging answer to the question about the role of love. And that answer is, in a word, ambivalence. That is to say, while many of us are committed to justice, it is not at all clear that we are, as King was, committed to pursuing this justice through a robust commitment to love. Now, I should say that ambivalence about the political propriety of love is not new to the work of racial justice. The wisdom of a movement based on love has been debated throughout every part of American history, whether you're talking about enslaved communities or the abolitionist movement or post-Reconstruction movements or even in the King's civil rights movement. And those who doubt both the wisdom and possibility of a social movement based in love are not to be dismissed. The reason for this is that the language of love, especially in the mouths of the powerful, often functions as a barely concealed attempt to maintain the status quo by the weight of moral censure. Now, tragically, this wicked deployment of moral language in the service of an immoral order can be seen throughout history, and it can be seen in our own time. Because of this, King's detractors are right to raise questions about whether the language of love is, in the end, counterproductive to the work of justice. But even so, this ambivalence, understandable as it is also very, very disconcerting. First, because it suggests a lack of clear understanding of love and what King meant by it. His was not naive, but profoundly radical and powerful enough, in fact, to get him murdered. Second, because this ambivalence means that we are now in the midst of a profound social movement whose moral foundations, meaning both its animating energies and its limits, are not in any way clear. Now, in saying this, I'm not seeking to dismiss the contemporary movement or lay some groundwork for that. I am of the belief that this movement, both diverse in its energy and effect, is bringing about transformations in every part of our culture. And I'm not trying to suggest that a movement has to have one single moral energy in order to be successful. But I am concerned that in love's absence, some of the most prominent features of our current cultural moment, epistemic confusion, moralizing sanctimony, tribalized identities, and cultural violence, have no source of redress. And finally, I'm concerned about it because it simply means that we have a widespread form of resignation, a doubt about whether we can finally live together in peace. In light of these things, I believe that we need to listen to King anew and to see his suffering, to learn from his interrogations, and to heed his call to stick with love. I am convinced that a movement that does not deliberately prioritize both the embrace and the practice of love will finally devolve into the disappointment of inner turmoil and social inefficacy, and also into the tragedy of spiritual disfigurement. Because of this, my hope is to invite each of us, as King did, to stick with love and to bear that love into the crucible of our own time. Now, what did King mean by love? And what do you mean when he asks us to stick with it? Now, the conventional way to answer this question, if you're in an academic institution, which you are, is to trace the autobiographical, theological, and philosophical roots of his vision of love. To consider, the closeness of his nuclear family, or the centrality of the black church, or the singularity of his community in Atlanta, or to consider the impact on King of Howard Thurman and the black social gospel, or the agapic thought of Anders Nygren and Paul Ramsey, or the theological personalism of Boston, blah, 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 Now, in this way, it would be possible to isolate and interpret the central themes, if not the intellectual core, of King's account of love. And I've attempted to do this myself. But the truth is that King's account of love is best understood not through tracing his formative sources, but by observing his pastoral exhortations and, above all, his practical choices. Not through intellectual genealogy, what he read, but through what Professor Charles Marsh calls lived theology, what he did and what he asked others to do. And after more than a decade considering these things, not least in the presence of Nicholas Walterstorff, hello, sir, it's nice to see you, I've come to believe that King's vision of love and what a movement based on love entails consists of four foundational elements. And while I really can't do anything like a comprehensive treatment, and don't worry, I'm not going to try, I do want to gesture toward them in hopes that we might renew both our personal and collective commitment to this love. What are these four elements? The first is what I refer to as the eyes of love. The eyes of love. That is a relentless commitment to see ourselves, our neighbors, and even our enemies as creatures made both by and for love. For King, this meant many things. It meant seeing one another as bearers of an ineradicable and very particular dignity. It meant seeing one another's particular pain, that all of us are wounded in every dimension of our lives, both as a spiritual affliction and through systemic assault. It means seeing one another's possibility, refusing to reduce one another to our worst selves, or to consign one another to our bleakest eventuality, but in the way of love to hope all things. And it meant deliberately cultivating this way of seeing as the foundational element of a renewed social order. Now, given that I'm speaking this at a Christian institution, this way of seeing persons sounds commonplace. After all, this is the foundation of a theological anthropology. But for King, it was more than this. It was the foundation of a political anthropology, or a theological anthropology made political. And viewed against the backdrop of both King's moment and our own, it is a deeply radical perspective. I mean, think about it. In King's time, political anthropology was essentially ordered in two ways. Racially, meaning that your political possibility was largely indexed to the race you were presumed to be. And ideologically, meaning that your political possibility was largely indexed to what you believe about, say, communism or democracy. Didn't matter what the Constitution said about you as a person. Those were the realities. That is how it was indexed. That was the functional political anthropology. And if you were on the wrong side of either one of those, your political future was at best at risk. But what of our own time? For all our presumptions of social evolution, a more than plausible case could be made that with respect to how we view ourselves and others, we are worse off than we were in King's time. Not only do the old racial and ideological maladies linger, but we have nursed new maladies into existence. Market anthropologies that reduce human social possibility to one's capacity to possess. Sexual anthropologies that index human political meaning almost wholly to the realms of sexual desire and practice. Tribal anthropologies that politically prioritize those with whom we share heritage, geography, and ideology, real or imagined, and these ideologies that feed on the existence of enemies. Each of these and others like them lie at the heart of our current political order and of many of the movements that are seeking to transform it. And in contrast to these, King would call us to see with the eyes of love, honoring dignity, grieving wounds, seeing possibility. Next, the second element is what I refer to as the works of love. The works of love. You have to understand that for King, his vision of love led him not only to a way of seeing, but to a way of laboring. And he wanted to see every part of society transformed, not just race. Remember, he talked about race, militarism, and capitalism, these things as being central to the challenges we were facing. But it's just as critical to understand that King was not only committed to seeing social change in America, but also pursuing that change in a way that was consistent with the demands of love. For King, as for those who follow him, this means not only a relentless commitment to push forward in the work of racial justice, but also to do so in a way that pulls back from the temptation to transgress the obligations of agape. So on the one hand, King understood this as the work of pushing forward. To the alarm of the steward of the status quo and the gradualists who placate them, King not only believed the imperatives of love required the creation of a new society, he believed that we had to push for it. We had to push for it. On buses and schools, in pulpits and police organizations, until that new society had come to be. He believed that love required us to push forward. And on the other hand, King understood the work of love as pulling back. See, one of the most interesting features of King's life is that even as he was resented by gradualists for pressing too hard, he was also resented by radicals for not pushing hard enough. And the reason for this was simple. Love was not simply the end to which he pressed, it was also the means by which he did so. Because of this, even as he pushed forward, there were things that he refused to say, actions he refused to take, and visions of America that he refused to embrace. Why? Because sometimes love requires pulling back. And as it was in King's time, so too it is in ours. On one hand, certain forms of gradualism with its sanctimonious presumption to set the terms and timetable for change. And on the other hand, certain forms of radicalism that can only abide a world made in its own image, that mistakes its anger for vision, its impatience for courage, and its violence for strength. These are on prominent display before us all the time. And in contrast, King says, no. We are to take up the works of love, to labor for a new world, but doing so in a way that sees not only that justice is the goal, but that love is the way. Third, the third element in King's vision is what we can call the suffering of love. One of the most painful contradictions of King's life and work is while he dreamed so much for America, he experienced so little of that dream for himself. The one who dreamed of beloved community was broadly reviled. The one who dreamed of economic plenty for all died with very little to his name. The one who dreamed of nonviolence died from a gunshot to the face. The dramatic nature of these discrepancies could tempt us to see King's life as singular, to see his suffering as uniquely his own. And in an important sense, it was. But it's also true that King viewed his suffering not as novel, but as normative. That he expected suffering for all who take up the way of love. He knew that seeing others with the eye of love did not mean others would see him the same way. He also knew that taking up the works of love did not mean that others would take up that work for him. He knew that, as he put it in his final speech, there would always be, quote, some difficult days ahead. He knew, in other words, that the call to love our neighbors and to seek their well-being inevitably entails self-renunciation. The prospect of suffering evokes dread in any age, as well it should. But in our own age, this is perhaps especially true because ours is an age whose chief end, arguably, is the avoidance of pain and the cultivation of victimhood. And while the reasonableness of much of this impulse seems to me to be true, we would also do well to consider its implications for our public life. How can people who were formed at every moment in the ways of entitled selfishness ever truly devote themselves to the work of self-renunciation? How can people who are obsessed with their own wellness ever tend to the wounds of others? And how can a society predicated upon the pursuit of happiness as a foundation of democratic life avoid collapsing into therapeutic selfishness? This was King's question in his own day, and I am sure it would be his question in our own. And what he's calling us to do is to become a people who seek the thriving of their neighbors and who are prepared to suffer to that end and are not surprised when it comes. He would call us to renounce our victimization identities and to see ourselves as suffering servants of our neighbors. And here's the final element of King's vision of love, what we could refer to as the hope of love. And this hope, as King described and lived it, needs to be understood in two ways, okay? The first is teleologically, meaning like as a goal or an aspiration. Look, the simple fact of the matter is that for Martin Luther King, from the beginning of his ministry until its tragic end, the ultimate goal of the movement for racial justice was not only the attainment of freedom of equality, but also the creation of what he called the beloved community. That even as he relentlessly pushed the nation toward racial equity, he did so with the ultimate aim of creating a society in which all human beings might live together in fellowship. He was not naive about the obstacles to this, but he was nonetheless committed that this was the goal, this was the hope of what we were doing together. Because of this, the call for love is a call to devote ourselves, hear me, to a vision of the future, a vision of a coming day in which, as he, in the dominant idiom of his day, put it, all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, I am free at last. That was the hope, the goal, the aspiration. And yet for King, hope is also understood dispositionally as a cultivated orientation of and openness to, indeed an expectation of, the final triumph of love. This can be seen in King's oft-quoted refrain, while the arc of the universe is long, it does what? It bends toward justice. See, though, as we have said, King's crucible years led him to reevaluate his beliefs and his hope in the end. In spite of the seemingly unending bleakness of that crucible, he found once again the disposition of hope. He continued to cherish the belief that in the end, racial prejudice, violent cruelty, and tragic waste would not triumph, but would be displaced by the advent of a community of love. Now, it's important to understand that for King, this was not founded either in a vague, if powerful, modernist notion of progress, the inevitability of progress. That's not where it was coming from. Nor by this abandonment of reality in the interest of sentiment. That's also not where it was coming from. He believed this because he believed in the coming of God. As he put it in a speech in Memphis on April 3rd, 1968, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Those were his last public words. It is this hope, both in its aspiration for healed relationships and its belief that God would come, that is perhaps the most radical element of King's vision of love. This is because it calls us, in a moment of instinctive contempt, in a culture of lazy cynicism, mistaking itself for realism, to be a people who both pursue the instantiation of love and who look, even through tears, for its coming. What then did Martin Luther King mean when he said he was going to stick with love? Simply this: that we, in the midst of our necessary and ongoing struggle for social transformation, become a people who see our neighbors with the eyes of love, who work with courage and self-restraint for their well-being, even at cost to ourselves, and who do so both striving for and believing in the day when hatred and all of its entailments are no more. That is what he meant. This is a defiant commitment that King, in the midst of immense suffering, made to his community on that Wednesday morning so long ago, and this is the commitment he pursued in word and in action until his murder 8 months later. And it is this commitment into which he invites his community and all of us to take up in our own time. And so today, on this day, set aside in his honor, I simply want to invite you, as both individuals and as an institution, to stick with love in your own labors toward the realization of justice in the world. For while, as King well knew, it is true that love does not preclude the reality of terrible wounding. It is also true that neither we, nor our neighbors, nor the world that we share can ever fully heal without it. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Salpe. I'll be asking some of your questions of Greg, and you have information here about how to deliver them to me. If you're in the room, you can raise a hand, and an usher will bring you a card or collect it from you to bring to me. I'm going to shift gears immediately because you don't give many public talks, and we're thankful for the one you gave.
Thank you.
But most of the work you have been doing has to do with what a student asked you this. I'd like you to talk about this first, the idea of cultivating moral imagination.
Okay. I don't give a lot of public talks. I haven't done that in probably 5 years. And I work at this level of what we call moral imagination. And here's what I basically mean by that. When I was a pastor, I would speak to my congregation, whom I loved, and many of them are watching right now, about race and about the transformation of America and about the injustices and things like this. And for some folks, even though they were orthodox theologically and they were generous economically, there was something in them that deeply resisted these things. And I could never understand what it was until I became clear that it was impossible for them to imagine an America in which America was not the greatest nation in the world, in which racism was a bygone reality, that capitalism is the best way to do all things. They couldn't imagine a world. And so anything that came up against that, and these weren't arguments people were making, it was just something going on inside, and some of you can feel that, you felt that. And over time I began to think, oh, this is not at the level of conscious thought or argument, this is at the level of the imagination. That somehow our imaginations have been malformed. And so the work for me became how do we take up this work of transforming people's imagination? I'll give you an example, kind of a colloquial example of my own life. I grew up in South Carolina, and not a lot of the folks that in my family went to college, and I had no real vision of my future until I watched the movie, The Dead Poets Society. And when I watched that movie, I was by myself, and I cried in that movie because I thought, I did not know this world was there. I did not know that it was possible, and suddenly I could imagine an alternative life for myself. It's like that. And so I began to think, as I left pastoral ministry and began to devote myself to working on race, I could give like public talks, making arguments, statistical arguments. I could give theological works about it, and I did write a book on reparations. But really, I think the work is at the level of the imagination. That's why I think King gave a dream speech. His most powerful speech and prominent speech to America was his dream speech, because he was seeking to help America reimagine itself on the basis of agape. And I think we're there. I think we're in the moment where the imagination needs to be healed and transformed. And so if you ever read my bio and you're like, this guy is crazy, he's doing like music and he's food and documentaries, like why is he doing all this? The reason my colleagues and I are doing this is because everything we do is targeted at the transformation, the healing of the American racial imagination through these alternative experiences, and that's what we mean.
And can you talk more about that? It occurred to me, you talked about food, and I want to ask you about this. Food, textiles, clothing, experiential opportunities for people. It's really about engaging the senses in this world, which is also probably why you love poetry.
Yeah, that's right. So here's an example. We're working on the National Memorial to the Underground Railroad in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is there's the border where Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and everybody crossed on their way to Philly. The first two HBCUs in the United States are there. Everybody came through there. No memorialization of any kind. So we're working on the National Memorial. It's going to be a large scale, very large scale landscape-based memorial. But we also thought, okay, how else could we help people understand this? Well, remembering that the Underground Railroad was fundamentally about hospitality, about welcoming people into your home, we thought, well, why don't we open up a restaurant and maybe a cocktail bar around that? And some of our Quaker friends were like, why does it have to be a cocktail bar? But what we did is we found a 1917 cocktail book published by Tom Bullock. He's the first African-American to publish a cocktail book. And so we're going to use those cocktails. We're going to develop those. But then we thought, what kind of food should we serve here? Well, given that the Underground Railroad was a collaboration between African-Americans and, in that community, Quakers, why don't we use historic African-American foodways, and why don't we also use Quaker foodways? So I know more about how to skin a rabbit according to 1850s Quaker cookbooks than you want to know right now. And so the idea is people then come and sit down in this restaurant, and there are images around them. There's an 8-foot-tall portrait of Harriet Tubman painted as a medieval icon. Get the big gold halo and everything around her. There are portraits of African Americans all over the walls. I don't know how many restaurants you've been in where everything is centered around African American cultural history. It's really powerful for people when they come in. But then we serve this meal, and it's African American foodways mixed with Quaker foodways in these really interesting ways. And what's happening is I don't have to give them a lecture about the Quaker collaboration. What I have to do, they taste the collaboration, and it becomes a sensory memory. Same thing with fashion. We're hosting a fashion show about the history of black fashion and how clothing was used as a tool for resistance and promoting its own dignity. And again, it's one thing for me to say that to you, but it's another thing for me to say, that Brooks Brothers suit that you see, W.E.B. Du Bois wearing, or when Miles Davis first started performing, he was always wearing like a pinstripe shirt and loafers with no socks. These guys were using the Ivy style and inverting it to show that they too had the dignity and the power they too belonged, and they made it look much cooler, to be honest, And so when we have these historic garments, we can help people understand. So even when you put on something like a chore coat, which is what I'm wearing right now, originated in France, but this is what enslaved people would have worn, something like this, large pockets, functional. When you see 19th century portraits, they're usually like this, but they're made out of cotton, and they're dyed in indigo, and they have wooden buttons. When somebody puts that on, and you can tell the story of the Underground Railroad and the triumph of that through something on our bodies, it just becomes a different conversation. And so that's really what we're trying to do.
And you produced the musical Union, and there's a question here, if I can get back to it, about the role that music plays specifically in pursuing a love-centric vision, whether connected or not to public corporate worship or secular.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, especially because John Whitfleet is probably lurking around here somewhere, and he would answer. I think that as I think about the role of the arts generally, I'm not trained in this way. My instinct, though, was people are coming to Memphis for 2018 for the 50th anniversary of his assassination. Again, we can do things in typical museum discourse where you come and King stood here and this happened here. Or we could tell the story in some more creative, powerful way. And because Memphis is so musical, Stax Music is there, which was the alternative to Motown. And Stax was deliberately integrated from the beginning. Interesting fact. We thought, why don't we do this? And I think it was only as I saw. So I went to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where we performed this. It went on tour, and it was a venue a little bit bigger than this, and it was about 50-50 African American and white. And people were coming with some anxiety, right, about what is this going to be? And this was pre all the hysteria about critical race theory. And so people were there, concerned, but at the end, everybody was standing up and clapping and dancing. And I thought, okay, I don't know what just happened here, but I've never had a sermon end this way. So I'm I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to do this. And so right now, the whole vocation is essentially trying to find these creative ways to awaken people to, I think, what they actually long for.
There are questions coming in about what it is to be a white man working in African American culture, and students brought this up this morning, where's the line between advocacy and cultural appropriation or just stepping on toes? How do you navigate that?
Well, so pretty much every day of my life is awkward. And it should be. Because, as we joked earlier, I'm this like big, slightly scary-looking Southern guy who wrote a book on reparations, is now, producing musicals about Black history, which is it's kind of weird, right? And I think if you answer it ideologically, like, as a white person, I should not have any role in this at all. I should not do this. It's always a preparation. I'm always displacing Black talent by even being in the room. That's an ideological perspective. Or if I should be able to do whatever I want to because I'm a creative and artists can do whatever they want, then I think you basically misunderstand the nature of the dilemma. And the only way that I have known to address this is in community. My colleagues, my African-American colleagues that I work with, I would say 50% or more of the conversations that we have are about how to navigate this. Including, what do y'all think about me writing a book on reparations? Do you think that's a good idea? If they had said no, you know what would happen? No book would have been written by me. What do you guys think about this Star and Lantern, the cocktail bar? How do you think we should structure the finances? And a lot of times my instincts are wrong. And they're like, actually, we shouldn't do that. You're bringing in certain kinds of investors, and that's going to exclude Black agency, and so we need to slow down. I guess the short answer is I have to navigate it in friendship and in community, because if I try to seek safety in some ideological position that answers all the things neatly, then I'm never going to do anything effective. And so instead, I have to walk the daily humiliation of, I really don't know what to do here, but I'd like to try this. What do y'all think? And then we try to do it together. That's really what it's like. If some of them are watching right now, y'all know I don't know how to do this. So we're just figuring it out together.
I was going to ask, what's the worst idea you've ever had? But let's move on. We have a very intergenerational audience today, and we have some middle schoolers with us. One would like to know, what does sticking to love for a middle school student look like? And what, during your own childhood, has helped you think deeply about Martin Luther King?
Okay, I'll answer the second one first. I think I just growing up in the South, growing up in the immediate embers of a segregated order, and realizing that every relationship I had was complicated because of this thing that I didn't understand and had inherited that made me feel vaguely guilty and vaguely superior, all the time. And even I was texting last night with my college roommate, African American guy, and we were joking the first month of our life together, we had no idea how we were supposed to navigate this. And so I think growing up gave me a sensitivity to this, and I think that led me to King. But I don't want to give you any impression that I was this, social justice activist when I was 11. I was not thinking about any of this. I like to be in the Black History Month, Lean on Me, performances during high school and stuff like that. But I was not thinking maturely about this. But I think my own wounds opened me up to this. I love that you're asking the question about how to do this in middle school. And I really think pretty much most of the stuff I said had to do with middle school because our political culture is really adolescent. And so I think that, I won't elaborate, but I think that I think part of it just means middle school is in some ways the training ground for functioning in an adult world. Because where else but middle school or in political campaigns are you so tempted to identify with a tribe and to exclude and include, to see people's greatest weaknesses and make fun of them for that, Where else? So seeing people in the image of God and really saying, you can't just reduce this person to that, whether their income or their, if they have some sort of disability or any other thing that middle schoolers will want to focus on. And same thing, okay, I'm going to see them, I'm going to and do that. I'm going to also take up the works to honor them. I'm going to try to spend time with folks that are marginalized. Some of you I know are going and sitting at the table where the kids eat by themselves. I remember that's a really important and powerful thing to do, to try to figure out how to find the kids. I say this to my own son. My youngest is a sixth grader. Just look for the people who nobody's looking for. Just look for them. And don't forget that. And I think that, so the eyes of love, the works of love, I think that all also entails some suffering. People are going to say, oh, why are you with that person? Why are you doing this? Who cares? It's embarrassing and it's very difficult, but I think that if you have a little crew around you that's all committed to this, it makes it much more tolerable. And then hope, just seeing that, middle school can be a really hopeless time. Like if somebody throws shade on social media, or if nobody is interested in you romantically or whatever, you can feel like this is awful, and there's no hope, and it's just not true. And try to renounce that discouragement that comes. So I love the question, and I'm happy to talk to you after if you want.
Thank you. Here's a listener who lives in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and is very interested in your plans for a national museum about the Underground Railroad. So can you talk a little bit about that project? And she asked, please provide information on how to support your effort.
Thank you. Well, hello to Chester County. That's where Kennett Square is. Chester County is this beautiful county in Pennsylvania. So for about 5 years, we've been just floating the idea of, given that this is such an important place for the Underground Railroad, given that this is such a powerful, this is the geographic site of America's first civil rights movement, okay? It's like Selma, or it's like Montgomery, except it's Chester County. Now, if I said Selma, something would come to mind. If I said Montgomery, things would come to mind. If I said Chester County, how many of you were like, yeah, okay? We don't know about it. But this is like one of the birthplaces of this abolitionist movement. And it was cross-racial, it was cross-gender, it was multi-class, it was amazing. Religious organizations partnering with people who weren't. And so I think what we want to do is try to do a national scale memorial there. But we had a design congress this past fall, October, where we brought all these scholars and philanthropists and artists together, and they were largely African-American, and said, what should this be? Well, first of all, should we do this? They said yes, which I was glad for. And then I said, what should this be? And we spent 3 days basically establishing the design process for that. Now, what that's going to mean now is this year, 2023, we're now building out a web presence, and we're beginning to do community engagement in a more deliberate way, and we're trying to do site selection. And so I think the easiest thing to do for somebody who wants to know about it or support is to go to our website, which is VU, Voices Underground, vuproject.org, and just send your information in, and we'll get back to you, because there's going to be a lot to do in these coming years. But thank you for the question.
You've done a lot of work around reparations, and here's a question. In what way do reparations connect to both King's vision of love and a biblical one?
So if you want to not make friends, one thing you should do is write a book on reparations. So if you find yourself just like, I'm getting invited to too many Christmas parties, what you should do is just kind of to take up reparations. So the basic idea of reparations is this, that America was predicated upon a form of theft. It wasn't only predicated upon that, but it was the theft of truth about who African Americans were and about our own history, the theft of power, taking agency away from African Americans, and the theft of wealth. That is beyond controversy. So then I began to ask, what is a Christian response to theft? People said, oh, you're writing a book on reparations. And I was like, no, I'm writing a book on how do you respond to theft, which happens to be reparations. And every 6-year-old knows, when you take something, what do? You give it back. Yeah, this is not a morally complex argument, okay? It's just not. What is complex is the function of it, how you understand who is included as those who owe reparations and who is included in those to whom it is owed. Like those are complicated questions. But there's a basic Christian impulse that when something is taken, you need to give it back, that America has never meaningfully considered in its relationship to African Americans. We've paid reparations to slave owners at emancipation. We have paid reparations to Pacific Islanders when we detonated nuclear bombs and destroyed their whole communities. We have paid reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned. We have paid reparations to, after a fashion, to Native communities. There was a whole reparations office inside the United States. But somehow, when we start talking about black people, guess what? It's all about reconciliation. And so it was basically saying, we already believe that when you take something, you give it back. And there is no question that many of the social experiences that we're having right now in terms of inequity are directly correlated to this. It's just not even hard to see it. And so why is the church not doing the thing that it teaches its 6-year-olds to do in Sunday school? Because there is not a political will. There's not political will. And as soon as you start talking about reparations, it's like, suddenly you're a Marxist. No, you're not. You are a Christian. And you know what? The January 6th assault on the Capitol, you know what that was? That was a reparations movement by white people. Stop the steal. That's what it was. They wanted their election back. Except the stealing in this case was fake. So you can't tell me the Christian church already believes in reparations. This is not a morally complicated argument. But what we lack is the moral courage and the political will to sacrifice ourselves and say, we have to return in ways that we can that are meaningful. The things that were stolen, we are not going to heal racially until we do that. I don't care how many racial reconciliation conferences we have. It's not going to happen. And so I realized that all my black friends were talking about reparations and all my white friends were talking about reconciliation. And I wrote the book to simply introduce white communities, more or less, to the conversation and say, like, this really matters. So I think I believe it's clearly a biblical argument. And I think that in King's vision, King, at the end of his life, was talking about a UBI, Universal Basic Income, and he was talking about theft. He had not gone all the way to reparations. I believe that he would have, because the logic of where he was going was there. But it's to say that King believed in a reparative vision, but he didn't have a specific program for reparations. But he said, why are we spending all this money on military? We need to redirect this money to the poor, these people that have been disenfranchised because of white supremacy. And I think he was right about that. So I hope that he would have liked the book.
Do reconciliation and reparations necessarily have to be opposites or exclusive to each other?
That's a great question. No, it's just, in my view, we have them out of order. Reparations is first. As somebody said to me in the middle of a march in Memphis, and we were talking about this, and he said, you just got to remember, we did not march so I could be friends with you. We marched so that my children wouldn't have a dramatically lower life expectancy than yours. And I was like, that is Jesus talking right there. And so I do think that a lot of what passes for racial work in American evangelicalism is essentially white people having black friends, sort of, and hoping that, like, by table fellowship, we can somehow obscure the fact that white folks own homes and black folks don't. In many, many cases, like, we can't do that. So I really think that the Christian church has got to take moral ownership, and I think we need to do it at the community level. The book is about asking churches to take responsibility for building reparations movements in their community. And I'm not sanguine about the federal government and what it will do in the short term. In this, I do think the federal government has a role to play, but I think local communities need to initiate a reparations movement, and that's why we have the Reparations Project as something that we're trying to build out.
In what way, if any, have you seen King's vision lived out in the years since his passing? And where do we still have to go still? That's probably a bigger picture. But where are you seeing this realized?
Well, I used to travel a good bit, and everywhere I would go, I would be amazed by the beauty and the creativity of people working in local community levels. When I look at the local communities, I see people giving of themselves. I see people taking ownership for their sin and their confusion. I see people trying to educate. I think it's happening in lots and lots of places. When I look at the national level, it's like not encouraging. You just think, this makes me sick when you see what's happening at national levels, because it all is like discursive warfare. And so what I think one of the confusing things right now is it seems basically impossible to cultivate what was a national scale movement. And I don't know that there should be, in terms of like a central leader who's setting a moral vision. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for local communities who are thinking, what was stolen here? How can we repair that? How can we give of ourselves? How can we do the long, slow, patient work of telling the truth and building memorials to that truth among us? And I do think that that's happening in many places, and I'm excited about that.
Good. Thank you. Let me give you the opportunity to clarify. The question is, should viewers walk away from this lecture with the notion that love is the only way to achieve King's dream? What about present-day racism, injustice, anger, frustration, fatigue that black people and others of color experience? How do we combat that? Love does not always salve murder.
Solve.
Murder.
Yeah, no. Yeah. It's a great question. I am saying quite explicitly that to invoke King without invoking the animating moral vision of his life is its own form of appropriation. And I think it happens all over the place. And I think that the thing to keep in mind is that anger, frustration, despondency, grief, shame, fury, wanting to just like elbow somebody in the throat, like all of those things that you feel, King felt. King felt. And if you read his letters and when you read his published works, he's more composed in his published works because they were largely open for white audiences. But the anguish is the thing that calls forth a commitment to love. I think it's an interesting phrase, love doesn't solve murder. What does? If there's an alternative, I'd like to know what it is. I too find myself like, I think to do this work requires you to be committed to sort of a low-grade depression and fury. No, I'm serious. Like all the time. To boil at the hypocrisies that you see, to feel just despondent about the inequities and the unbelievable waste of resources that parts of our community are doing on, perpetuating their own sense of victimization or securing their own lives or whatever. I think that's just part of the world right now. And if you are open, your eyes are open, I don't know what else to do except to carry that trauma, to grieve it, and to see trauma therapists and to try to figure out what I want to do is humiliate this person right now, but I can't because that is me refuting the very thing that I allegedly am fighting for. And I think that is the moral work. I mean, I remember sitting with James Lawson. Some of you probably know who James Lawson is. He was, King says he was the greatest theorist and practitioner of nonviolence in the 20th century. A century that also included Gandhi, by the way. And Lawson studied with Gandhi, and I remember sitting with him at Claiborne Temple in Memphis 3 years ago, and I said this same question: How do we do this? And he said, because you have to keep in mind what we're trying to do. And I said, well, what is it? He said, to astonish the earth. And I think that was just a very beautiful thing that it's not just what we're doing, it's the way that we do it. And that was a transformative word for me, to astonish the earth. I just love that.
Greg, thank you so much for being with
you.
us today.
Yeah,
Thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow. Wow.